I remember the first time that I saw anything from this promotion. I forget what year it was or why, but I tuned in one day out of sheer curiosity for the most part, and the first segment that I ever saw from this company was Kurt Angle maliciously beating AJ Styles to a bloody pulp to close the show. Now, I was a kid at the time, and back when I started watching wrestling full time back in 2008, Chris Jericho and Shawn Michaels were having a nice little feud for themselves. And right around the start of this feud, they had a match at the Great American Bash where Shawn started gigging from his eye, further selling the injury from when Jericho threw Shawn headfirst into the Jeritron 5000. Now, I couldn't afford to watch every single pay per view from WWE at the time and TNA as well, so as a kid, I would just wait until the next night on Raw and on Thursday for TNA to see the results and the aftermath of such events. I wasn't hip to dirt sheets or review forums or anything like that, so it was all a mystery right up until the show was well underway. They replayed the Jericho vs. HBK match in a nice little 5-minute video package, as they do, and for the very first time, I saw an in progress storyline take place where the babyface started gigging hard, and 9-year-old me couldn't handle watching it. It literally made me cry. I knew that wrestling was fake and all, but it was still as real as any other TV show for me, if not more so because the fucker was actually bleeding like a pig out there. It was all just too much for me at the time, like watching a scary movie before bed or something. I hated scary movies when I was younger too. I remember getting Uncharted Drake's Fortune for Christmas back in 2009 and playing the living shit out of it, right up until the part where the game suddenly turns into Resident Evil and literally corners you with Nazi zombies. I didn't pick the game back up for like a year after that. I signed up for an action adventure, not survival horror. I could go on and on about how other games like God of War were way too much for me and too gruesome for me back then, even though I know that most of my friends at the time just loved all that gruesome shit. I was a good boy. But the point is that WWE was a PG show when I started watching, and Sean gushing blood like that was not PG at all. Now let's fast forward to when little old me decided to watch TNA wrestling for the first time, and I saw an innocent man in AJ Styles getting mauled in front of Karen Angle by her husband Kurt Angle because he believed that she was cheating on him with AJ and decided to split his fucking head open and make her watch regardless of whether or not it was him that she cheated with or if she cheated at all in the first place. At least that's how I remember it based off of how the segment went down. From that moment on, I sort of kept my distance from TNA and treated it like the far too real wrestling show, where things just got a little bit too intense for my liking, which was scary as a kid that was maybe considering becoming a professional wrestler. It's funny, I look back on times like this when I would go to school and me and my friends would talk about how we'd rather go to WWE instead of TNA. Not because WWE was the better promotion that paid better or anything like that, as if we knew or cared. We all just thought that TNA was the wrestling company that hurt a lot more, whereas WWE was a lot more safe, I guess. Now, I grew out of it pretty quickly as a kid. I eventually did pick up the controller and beat Uncharted Drake's Fortune a few times. I did eventually pick up games like God of War again as well, and I allowed myself to watch horror flicks because I realized pretty quickly that it wasn't as scary as I let it be in my little head. I did eventually grow up to fear the real scary stuff, like adjusting in the real world, where pretty much no one cares about whether or not you survive on this planet before it eventually dries the fuck up in our lifetime. Scary movies ain't got shit compared to what's really out there. We watch scary movies for fun. TNA did eventually stop being that game that I wouldn't pick up, or that scary movie that I refused to watch. Right around the tail end of 2009, I started watching TNA way more often and a lot more frequently. At first, because through the magic of YouTube, I discovered that Jeff Hardy was once a full-time wrestler for them back in 2005. And after he left WWE back in 2009 thanks to CM Punk, hated that fucker for what he did to him back then, I was convinced that Jeff was going to turn up on an episode of Impact. Again, I didn't read dirt sheets back then. I was just a fan expecting my all-time favorite wrestler to show up on the opposing promotion out of sheer hope. I truly believed that he would show up eventually. And what do you know? He did. Talk about getting lucky. I remember it clear as day watching the January 4th episode of Impact back in 2010 when TNA decided to debut on Mondays to try and compete with WWE, where even from my side they failed. I was constantly paying more attention to Raw out of habit between the two shows. Jeff made his big re-debut in the first 20 minutes or so of the show, coming out to his old theme song Modest, a song that I just could not stop binging as a kid. I knew that on the same episode where Hulk Hogan was making his grand appearance that Jeff couldn't have been too far behind. And boy, let me tell you that January 4th, 2010 episode of TNA was pivotal for me as a kid. TNA quickly went from the gruesome, real, and scary hardcore TV 14 show to the edgy, cool rival WWE promotion that was way better than the PG kids show crap in WWE. It's very much a similar phase that wrestling is going through today with AEW in the fallen TNA's place. Let's hope for their sake, and even for the sake of pro wrestling, that AEW doesn't die the same death that TNA did, for making a lot of stupid mistakes that could have been completely avoidable, or at least for mistakes that I'd like to believe were completely avoidable. After TNA's attempt at taking over wrestling on Monday nights failed, I started watching them religiously every week when they started back on Thursdays. TNA had managed to keep me hooked as a fan, not only with Jeff Hardy being on the show, but with guys that I already knew from WWE like RVD, Mr. Anderson, and Ric Flair, whom of which was acting like a completely unhinged version of himself, opposite of the sweet old man that I once knew getting a big farewell from the entire WWE roster after being forced to retire by Shawn Michaels, because that was my first real introduction to the guy. And I became a fan of TNA through their OGs like Beer Money, the Motor City Machine Guns, Jay Lethal, Amazing Red, and especially AJ Styles. I loved TNA so much as a kid that my second ever in-person wrestling event as a kid, after going to a WWE event in 2008, live event in 2008 in Madison Square Garden, was going to a 2010 TNA live event in the Hammerstein Ballroom. That WWE live event had nothing on that TNA show. At that WWE live event, I got to see CM Punk jump off the steel cage in the main event against JBL for the World Heavyweight Championship while watching it from all the way up in like the mid row. But that TNA show though, I saw crazy ass dives for the first time. Thanks, Amazing Red. I saw the X Division Championship change hands unexpectedly. Congratulations, Amazing Red. I saw motherfuckers go through tables, beat each other with weapons, bleed. I saw Abyss bleed hard way from a chair shot to the head from Tommy Dreamer in the main event. And looking back, was that stupid? Yeah. But was it cool? So fucking cool as a kid. And I saw all of this in the very front row as well. And midway through the show, I got to meet just about all of the wrestlers that were competing. One of which that just so happened to be Jeff fucking Hardy. That show is like top 3 memories for me as a kid. I didn't just get to see wrestlers wrestle. I got to interact with them and take some pretty badass pictures with them. I was like 10 at the time, so they were all super nice to me and it was fucking awesome. I did kind of annoy the fuck out of Jeff Hardy though, because I caught him rolling his eyes at me after I wouldn't stop watching the guy even after the show was over. No, he was in the ring with RVD taking pictures with fans after the main event, but still. TNA gave me memories like that live in person, and memories on their show of storylines that even to this day I have a soft spot for, like RVD getting mauled by Janice on their whole effing show themed episode of Impact. Or especially the Immortal reveal where Hulk Hogan and Eric Bischoff took over the entire company under the nose of Dixie Carter, turning Jeff Hardy heel in the process, which blew my fucking mind as a child. I still to this day want to know the end result of what would have been with Jeff Hardy and his feuds with the likes of Mr. Anderson and especially RVD, because we never got to see any of those storylines unfold like they should have due to, well, what happened at the end of Victory Road 2011. But hell, even the Victory Road 2011 incident wasn't enough to stop me from waving their flag as a kid. I was that fan that praised them heavily, even in the face of harsh criticism, which more often than not was completely fair. Criticism, that is, that was completely fair. I still believed in TNA. But slowly over the course of that year in 2011, Specifically, I guess you could say right around after that Victory Road incident took place, it was all pretty much downhill for me as a fan. Now, around the beginning of 2014 was when I stopped watching wrestling altogether. Wrestling that year in general was a complete blur for me as my interest shifted over to video games, and not even moments as big as Brock Lesnar ending the Undertaker's WrestleMania streak at WrestleMania 30 was enough to get me to care. Hell, neither was CM Punk leaving the company altogether earlier that year, and I really grew to love his work during and after the Summer of Punk phase in 2011. And ironically, it was his podcast with Cole Cabana that later that year that brought me back to wrestling, but that's not all that important right now. The point is, 2011 was the year that, while yes, I was still at the peak of my fandom as a TNA diehard, but I was soon to be on the descent, and they're the ones partially to blame for that. For whatever reason, I felt the urge to cover this particular PPV pay-per-view event from TNA. Like I said, I still have a soft spot for some of their old storylines, and occasionally I'll go and check out some of the old stuff whenever I miss it enough. And one match that I admittedly never got the chance to see even after all these years, after finally being able to afford to watch any wrestling show that I wanted, was the 30-minute Iron Man match between Bobby Roode and AJ Styles for the TNA World Heavyweight Championship. It was a match that even intrigued the hell out of me back then, and I never sat down to actually watch Final Resolution 2011 from start to finish. So finally I did, and the show sucked. A lot of the TNA that I once knew and loved as a kid has aged considerably poorly. The Impact Zone and their presentation was trashy as all hell. The commentary was underwhelming at best, and at worst, it was worth tuning out when you could, because thankfully they weren't loud enough to outright get in the way of the show itself with their constant rambling about almost nothing important whatsoever, because they were just so clearly trying to get through this shit show. Like, I'm sure so many fans at home that actually paid the $50 for this when it came out was, especially when they couldn't get their shit together to properly air the correct footage for the Knockouts Championship match between Gail Kim and Mickie James, just to name one example. A match that in the end was almost not even worth the effort in the first place. Then there was a match between Robbie E. and Eric Young for the TNA Television Championship, a belt that had way too many name changes to be taken seriously, in a match that was unbearably boring and entirely unnecessary for a pay-per-view card for a show that didn't need it in the first place, in a company that in all honesty couldn't even afford to have worthless matches like these on any pay-per-view card of theirs, as proven by the fact that the TNA name is dead and gone in 2021. And Impact today is now lucky to get 200,000 viewers on their best day, no matter how good their show might be that week. I think TNA really did a number on pro wrestling in a bad way. I think shows like Final Resolution 2011 is a good example as to why. You have Jeff fucking Hardy in the company still, with every single one of his diehard fans that are still behind him, even after showing up live on pay-per-view smacked out of his mind, and your first instinct is to put the motherfucker in a feud with Jeff Jarrett of all people? Why? And furthermore, how the hell did you go from starting the year with Beer Money and the Motor City Machine Guns challenging for the tag team championships live on pay-per-view to Matt Morgan and Crimson defending them against Devon and the Pope of all people? Not even decent matches like RVD versus Christopher Daniels or Kurt Angle versus James Storm could save this show. Hell, if there were anything worth watching on this show at all, surprisingly enough, it was the X Division Championship match between Austin Aries and Kid Cash. A great match, further highlighting Austin's run in the company as being one of the only highlights not only on this show, but for TNA as a whole at the time as well. And I'm not taking anything away from Bobby Roode. His run at the top was by no means a bad thing, but damn has it aged a lot worse now considering the star that he never became today, that he very well could have been. AJ went on to greater things, obviously, but not long after this match was the Claire Lynch angle that, if anything, just weighed AJ down that year and drove away even more fans. But I'm sure that I'm just preaching to the choir at this point. TNA certainly had its bright spots in 2011 with the likes of AJ Styles and Austin Aries among others, but at the end of the day, you're just sifting through garbage, and at what point does that become futile? The main event itself between Rude and AJ was fine and even excellent at parts, but was it worth having that match in this promotion? Big global television deal and all, knowing good and well that the heads that were running this company were far too stuck in their ways and that was likely never to change. I think time speaks for itself. Looking back at it all now, I'm not that same wrestling fan that only saw TNA through the rose colored lenses. The last wrestling show that I went to as a kid was a TNA live event in 2011 in an arena that was 85% empty. In the front row like last time, but surrounded by a crowd that wasn't even close to being as lively as the Hammerstein Ballroom crowd that I was in the year before. And hell, it wasn't all bad. I got to meet most of the wrestlers during that show like I did the last one, but this time around when it came from the main event, I was falling asleep trying to convince myself that what I was watching was entertaining. And you know what? I think that sums it up quite nicely, really. Final Resolution 2011 was garbage.